practices, and I would be curious to hear a little bit from you, and especially now that we're in a virtual context, when you interact with students, how do you handle the pronoun part, particularly if it's like virtual or by email or so on? And I think like that actually requires some kind of thought that is a little bit different than when we were sort of in a face-to-face context. Pronouns are, right, like it's something that has been talked about for, I would say pretty much the past 2 decades. Like the first time that I saw people use like or talk like that, it's documented. It's actually more with the pronouns z. And I don't know if some of you have read the book Stone Butch Blues. It's sort of a classic. And let me just see if I can maybe find just to share this with you. By Leslie Feinberg, who by the end of their life actually transition genders. So I don't know if you can see here, the Stone Butch Blues. So this is like a classic of lesbian literature. And then after that, Leslie Feinberg went to transition and begin identifying more as a man. And so started using Z. And that was in the 1990s, the late 1990s that it was first put out there. But I think like a lot of the ways in which they also picked up is through social media, that people had kind of more opportunities to be in dialogue with each other. And it's not really a top-down type of approach, right? Like in a way we're trapped in grammar, and there was he and she. But there has been a proposal that has come more from the community, not necessarily from the medical community or from psychologists or so on, really people in the community who have built that term and have asked to be called through they. Now, one thing that is important to have in mind is that sometimes when we think about a person who was assigned a particular gender at birth, and transitions to another gender, the word another is important. Sometimes when we think about trans, we think about trans only as people who have transitioned to what we would call, quote unquote, the opposite gender. You could have people who are in between and do not identify necessarily as man or woman, but it could be gender non-binary, gender non-conforming. And at the same time, it's important to not make the assumption that people who would be in that quote unquote middle would necessarily identify with they. And so that's why the most common protocol, if it's an interaction that would require to know that, is to ask for the pronouns of the person. Which pronouns do you use? But there are also plenty of situations where it's not necessary to know the pronouns that a person uses, right? Like if you are paying at the grocery store and you're not sure of the pronoun of the cashier, there's no reason why you should really know which pronoun they go by. So, so it's about, right, cutting a fine balance in a certain sense, like how to make the space welcoming, how to be able to make space for everyone to be themselves, and that could include pronouns. I was in a group, which was actually like a meditation training group, and there was a debate in the group if we should use they to refer to everyone. And the theory that some of the people in the group had was because if we use she or he, then that can be stressful for people who identify in the middle. But then the other counter argument to that was like, what about people who have transition and kind of are making a really conscious choice of being called she or he? And so for this reason, as a group, we decided that, you know, people, the best etiquette was to be called by the pronouns that we would want to be called by. So that's just like a sort of in a nutshell, some of the ideas related with pronouns, but I'm curious to hear first two things. Like first, have you ever heard other pronouns than she or he or they being used? And in which context? And I would be curious about that if you are familiar with any other pronouns.
I had a situation where they used Z, and I found myself saying he, and it was kind of awkward. So how do you combat against that? How do you make sure that you're being intentional and in their space, making them feel comfortable?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I forgot to explain that part. That is pretty key. Yeah, so the etiquette too is if you make a mistake, you apologize, use the right pronoun, and then move on. Usually instead of making a huge deal out of it, right? Like, so instead of if the person says, I go by Z, and then you use he, then they say, oh, I go by Z. And then you're like, oh, I'm sorry, Z. And then you continue. But if you go on, oh, you use Z and I use he, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Oh, I used the wrong. If you go on, it's going to get like a big deal. So usually the recommendation is just to go to the right pronoun and then continue the conversation. You've been informed, and you know that those things happen. It's just recognizing it and moving on is the best strategy. And that doesn't come from me. If you look at different GLBT organizations, that's often the recommendation that is out there. Oh yeah, that's right. That's the difficulty, right? Sometimes that like not making a big deal about it. But I think kind of when we feel bad about it is like sort of this part of ourselves that is trying to be in good relationship with the other person. We feel bad because we don't want to hurt them or offend them or make them feel bad. So it's like kind of slowly beginning to think like apologize once and then move on, because that's actually what will make the person feel more honored, and instead of kind of like, okay, yeah, I'm aware you go by Z, and then moving on. But I understand sort of this idea that it can be, right, like nerve-wracking if you make a mistake about someone's pronouns. But that can always happen. And there's an easy way to move on from it. Should I correct other people for getting someone's pronouns wrong, like a professor or student? Okay, that's great. It depends on the context, but if you're able, I would say if you're able to let know the person, I would say that's the preferred situation. And again, like it can be just communicated. Oh, I think that so-and-so goes by they, and then moving on. But if you can pull the person aside, like that might be a good strategy. Let's say it's at the end of a class or something like that. Or you receive an email from a professor referring a student to your services, and they're using the wrong pronoun, like you can maybe just send a small note about it. That would be a strategy. Sometimes I hesitate about it, but I feel that if it has been done kind of repetitively and then they keep calling a student she, but they go by they, then I usually say, oh, I think that so-and-so goes by they. And then usually whoever was calling them, let's say she, will be, oh, I'm sorry, and then we move on. But yeah, I think like we're in an interesting time where pronouns don't always look like how people look. And so it's possible that we're going to make mistakes. And I think people are also aware of that. I think the problem is more when someone has communicated that they would be like to call with a certain pronoun and it's not honored. That's usually when I have seen complaints from students. And so it's important kind of to have that reciprocity if it's communicated. I don't know if that responds the question, Aldo. Okay.
It did, thank you.
Great. Other questions?
What is the importance of pronouns? Why is it like a big deal?
Yeah, I think, I think that we don't always realize, but right, language is kind of like so deeply ingrained, like within us, we could say in certain ways. So I don't know if you have stories where you were called the wrong pronoun, like even if you identify with your gender and are read, like sometimes you get in the mail like a letter, Mr. So-and-so or products, blah, blah, blah. And then you're like, I'm not Mr. Right? Then it feels like pretty deep. So the importance is to honor the ways in which someone wants to be seen and portrayed in the world. And it can run pretty deep if someone is like, if that's not honored, right? Like it can run pretty deep in the sense that the person is communicating who they are in the world, how they want to be addressed. And to not do that would be in some ways disrespectful, right, to the person and potentially hurtful. There's also like Title IX implications. There's actually, if it goes all the way, then it's well documented and so on. It goes all the way to legal implications. So gender identity is protected under Title IX. And so that means that if a student was repetitively addressed with a certain pronouns by a certain office on campus, they could actually put a complaint to the Title IX office because gender identity falls under that purview of the law. And so there are legal implications too. So that doesn't mean that if you messed up once or maybe twice that then like it's right, like that there's going to be like implication with Title IX office. But if it's repetitively done, if the students feels harassed and that their gender is not respected, they have actually room for complaint. So that's also, in a legal sense, it also has implications. Maybe one little thing about the thing that I was going to say about Spanish. So in Spanish, maybe you have heard that, right, like there's words that end in A, there's words that end in O. So I don't know, bonito and bonita, I'm going to put it in the chat. So bonito would be masculine, bonita would be feminine. But now there are some people in the community and the media that are beginning to use terms like bonite, and E would be gender neutral. And so that's not necessarily something that, right, you have an aunt who lives in a Latin American country, she will know, but it's not in the dictionary, but it's starting to pick up in the queer community in different Latin American countries, and particularly in the US among Spanish-speaking speakers. So just something to have in mind, not necessarily that you would need to use that ending, but that if you ever see that, it might refer to gender neutral adjective in this case. Any questions? Any comments?
I have, it's more of like a thinking, I guess, and then it could be phrased into a question, but I'm glad that you brought that up in terms of just like Spanish, since it's a heavily gendered language and everything. there's just a lot of potential issues that might happen when referring to either a group of females and then you add a male, or just little things like that. So I guess what I'm trying to say, my question is, given that Latinx is intended to create more inclusive language or vocabulary, I understand that some of the research that I've done regarding Latinx and just like understanding it, I know that there is some fear from either more conservative communities that feel that the language might be erased or that might be changed, and that's something that they're that's on their mind, those types of communities. So I kind of wonder, what do you feel like the future for Latinx and just how it used to be Latin at, and just thoughts around that, I guess. I know that's like a loaded question, but anything is good.
Yeah, no, this is great. There's actually an article, and I'm trying to think, I think it's a Journal of Latino Studies, it's still called. And that talks about it as a generational shift that kind of, and we see that, I think, all over the country, right, in terms of departments and organizations that often student orgs actually are the ones who have picked up the Latinx, and you have more the programs and the departments that have stayed with the A and the O and have not necessarily transitioned to the X. And so in that article, it talks greatly about a generational divide almost that is out there. And I think that it's interesting that student organizations are using the X. And so I'm wondering in a way if that will follow people throughout the different organizations that they go through in life. And if for example, Latino will become part of, not the past, but right, like kind of like will lose traction to a certain extent, since it's a generational shift, we could say. One of the parts of this debate too is that people talk about how in the X, we lose kind of the specificity, or for example, like challenges that, let's say, Latina women might be going through, for people for whom that identity has meaning. And so it's always like a tension, right? Like between what do you gain when you go towards a gender neutral term, and what do you also lose in terms of what might still have meaning for some people. How language at the same time also can point us towards, right, a future that is a little bit less kind of gender binary geared, as you have very much in Spanish. Yeah, I think there's no perfect answer to that, but I think there's definitely a shift in that it's moving more towards the X, as we can see younger organizations picking that up and bringing that with them throughout the years.
Thank you. That was really insightful.
Great.
So I have one question related to this. And so it's really interesting because I read an article not too long ago. So you know how in Latinx, in Spanish, we don't have the X sound, or at least it doesn't sound like a vowel. And there's actually some people that reject the term in Mexico and Spanish-speaking countries because we don't have that sound. And so I'm just wondering how there is some reaction from people who speak Spanish. So I'm just wondering if the word like Latinx is it only applies for people who speak English and are Latinas or Latinas. And so I'm just curious how to approach this. Since you know it's not in the language, it's in the Spanish language. I don't know what will be the adaptation to this term.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because I have seen that having currency in the US, right? Like when I was referring to the students' organizations, they're mostly organizations that are in the US, while in Latin America, we don't see, well, first the term Latinx is not necessarily kind of doesn't have the same currency or the same necessity in Latin America, right? Like the markers around ethnicity and race and so on are different, and Latinx is not one of them, so the term has less importance in that context. So on one hand, yes, like kind of the X in Latin America has not been as prevalent. However, the E that I was mentioning, I actually have seen it used. There was in the media to a certain extent. So there was a report about Sam Smith, right? And he declared that he was, I think, gender non-binary, or I don't remember which term he used, but basically he didn't identify with the gender binary. And this is a report, right, of like, as if you know, like how the media world circulates between the US and Latin America. It's interesting to notice too how a lot of the shows that are produced in Miami actually end up in the living rooms of people all across Latin America. So while I think that there are particular terms that might not be shared across the sort of the Latinx population in the US and Latin America, I think that there's a dialogue that greatly happens through the media, and kind of you have hubs that are there, and that would be Miami, LA, Mexico City, sort of these places that kind of like have some kind of reach in other parts of Latin America. And if the E is used, at least in terms of the media, it might circulate in a different way. So I know that I kind of went a little bit further, but yeah, Latinx kind of definitely would be mostly in the US.
Thank you.
Do you have any tips or suggestions on addressing pronouns virtually, like in emails, or if it's not on the screen?
Yeah, I think there's something about creating a culture, right, of pronouns. And for example, I don't have mine, but I should have them. And so kind of creating it on the screen so it becomes something a little bit more normalized, at least on Zoom and these types of spaces. But in terms of emails, I think that we're often responding directly to the person. So it's not always an issue, but if you're not sure, if you, for some reason, let's say you are referring a student to another office and you say she needs help with, or he needs help, you can always use their name instead. So if their name is Patrick, like instead of he needs help, you can, and if you're not sure, you can say Patrick needs help for X, Y. So that's the way of going around the pronouns, that if you're uncertain. And another way, like you could use they, and the person at the other office will understand. So these are two ideas. I don't know if you have other ideas or how you're navigating that in this context.
One thing that I also do is put my pronouns in my email signature. So whenever I send an email, if the individual has to respond to me, then they know how to refer to me.
Great. And I think like the more of us do that, then the most normalized it becomes, and then it becomes a culture in itself.
For me, I think when you're introducing yourself, you say your pronouns when you're talking to anyone. I think it's just allow them to be aware of how they're going to refer to you, and if they're going to talk to someone else about you.
Great. Other suggestions?
If it's a first time email, like an introduction or something like that, I always say, my name is Natalia Walton, my pronouns are, just just to put it in there. And like you said, if I am speaking to them and they haven't addressed their pronouns, then I just use their name.
Yes, great. Yeah, so I think like in a virtual world, we have kind of to really almost document like these strategies that we're using and kind of recirculate them, because I feel a lot of the strategies out there, if you look online, are person-to-person, kind of face-to-face type of interactions. But I think this new context really requires us to develop kind of new tips on how to create a culture where everyone feels that they have space to, right, to have their pronouns being honored, we could say. So, yeah. All right, I think you end the meeting at 10:45 or something like this?
No, we ended at 11, but I was going to end it a little bit earlier.
Okay.
Sue-Ann actually wanted to get your contact information and kind of pick your brain.
Yeah.
If you could tell us a little bit about your book also.
Okay. Yeah, I'm putting my email on the here, but let's see, I had the book because I did the reading on Wednesday. So yeah, here is the book. It's called Tortilleras, Negotiating Intimacy. The cover was designed by an artist in Mexico. I often get questions about it. And she actually has been documented the feminist and the lesbian feminist movements for decades. Like, she has pictures, she has drawings, and the book is called Tortilleras, Negotiating Intimacy, Love, Friendship, and Sex in Queer Mexico City. And it's an ethnography. So my PhD was in gender studies, but I did anthropology before for an MA. So by doing anthropology is basically, right, you go to the field, you talk with people, you interview them, you get a little bit their ideas on the particular topic that you're working on. And in this case, it was how relationships were changing in Mexico City at a time when people were discussing things like same-sex marriage, anti-discrimination laws, civil unions. But I was not super interested in talking about the marriage aspect and so on. I'll put a link in a moment. I was more interested in looking at other relationships. So there's a chapter that is on polyamory, there's a chapter that is on friendships, there's a chapter on sex, and there's a chapter on community building. So I was more interested, not so much kind of, you know, how people now are getting married or unions and so on, but more kind of what are the consequences of this being put on the table, and how do people relate with these new relationship models? So is everyone rushing to these relationship models, or are people questioning the ways in which we can form love, friendship, intimacy, and so on? And so that was, yeah, that was interesting. It was between 2009 and 2016 that I did this study. And it was interesting to see how people were thinking about their relationships and so on. And so that's the book that it actually came out in June, but because I did the book launch this week, it feels kind of that it just came out now. Somehow that's the feeling that I got from it. Let's see, I have here on the chat the link to it if you're interested. Yeah, so that's the book. And I have a 30% coupon that I can send to you too. That I can send to Natalia, and if anybody is interested, you can tap into it. Any questions about that or?
You're phenomenal, Anahi.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, but you were at the reading on Wednesday, so
I was.
yeah, thank you for coming. So yeah, so you got a little bit the full story for 45 minutes at least of kind of the content of the book.
Yes, I highly recommend it. And I want to thank you for coming and joining us and helping us conceptualize pronouns. It was wonderful. Does anyone have any questions for Anahi?
Let's see, I think that I can put in the chat the 30%. Maybe I'll have to send it to you later, but I was looking for the basically the 30% coupon, which makes it better to have that. But
Well,
yeah,
the paperback isn't that expensive, but the hardcover like $126.
Actually, yeah, here it is. Anyway, if anybody's interested, then you can get the 30% coupon.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for inviting me and for your questions and for everything. And yeah, it sounds you're